So how many of you have heard of Dr. Nedley before you came here today? So quite a few. Good. Dr. Nedley is the founder and medical director of the community-based and residential Nedley Depression and Anxiety Recovery Programs, and also Optimize Your Brain. Dr. Nedley is an award-winning practicing physician who also serves as president of Weimar University, a higher education college that houses the New Start program, which is a health and wellness program that's also used around the world. He has presented and published numerous scientific studies in the medical scientific literature and is well known as an author, public speaker, and teacher throughout the world. And we're excited to have him here today. For those that were here last night, I know I was blessed just learning about ways that you can improve brain function and health through nutrition and exercise. And we welcome you this morning, Dr. Nedley. While he's coming up, let's have prayer, and then there are going to be some children's programs downstairs for those 8 and under. If the parents are interested, that is available downstairs. If not, you're welcome to keep your child with you up here as well. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings to us, for health, for the opportunity to be in Montana and to enjoy a presentation this morning from Dr. Nedley. We ask that you would guide our hearts and our minds that we might have a better understanding of you, of the health that you want to give us through the incredible creation that you have created in the human being. We thank you for the blessing of your love and of your faithfulness to us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you. It's good to be in Montana with all this beautiful greenery and even the rain. I know you don't get as much rain as some sections of the U.S., so I'm sure you're being blessed by this rain here as well. And it was nice to connect with some people. I actually grew up in Michigan. One of the reasons why I like blueberries is Michigan blueberries are also very special. And of course, there's a lot of swampland in Michigan, and so a lot of moisture for these big, giant blueberries that we talked about last night. But I met a gentleman from Monroe, Michigan, that actually knew my father. And my father was actually an engineer, but he was also a very good musician, did a lot of music arrangement. There's a story behind how he got so good at arranging music and composing music. He actually composed the wedding march of my bride, Erica, and actually timed it for how many paces from the back of the church to the front of the church, and how it transitioned as she went into the altar and all of those things. But he would arrange quartet music for the 4 males, and he would fly around Michigan in a little airplane, and so and they would do services for a lot of the Michigan churches, and they actually did lunch with this gentleman from Monroe, and they called themselves the Flying Four. But he told me something that I didn't know about. And of course, I was very young at the time, and one of the reasons why I'm a pilot, of course, is he was a pilot. I would actually do his instruments. I learned flying by instruments before I learned how to fly an airplane, actually, with his IFR and all the IFR types of approaches in Michigan with a lot of rain and a lot of low clouds. But he said there was a period of time where their plane needed extensive repairs. And so there was about a year or two where they were going around and they were driving and not flying. And they called themselves, he said, the Grounded Four when they ran around. And I had never heard that before, but I'm sure it sounds very much like my father and the 3 others. The nice thing about that is those arrangements, we still sing today. I have 4 sons, and we'll do quartet music and very much enjoy doing those arrangements that my father made of old. So nice to have some memories, and coming to rural Montana, I had no idea I was going to learn about that, but it's a blessing. Well, today we're going to be talking about the emotional health of children and adolescents. And as you can see, as you will see, we are in crisis today in regards to the emotional health of our children and adolescents. But we're also in crisis even among adults. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, what is it? Those two words were used together in a scientific paper for the first time in 1937. But it became much more popular when Daniel Goleman wrote his book in 1990 on emotional intelligence. And now there's been measurements, and we can actually have people take emotional intelligence tests, kind of like they take IQ tests. And so what is it? It's understanding your emotions and the emotions of others and responding to those emotions, how? In a healthy way. Sounds pretty simple, but it's obviously involved. Our behaviors powerfully influence our thoughts and emotions. This is why we talked about nutrition in the brain last night. And we talked about exercise and even light. Those are behavioral things that can actually have an effect on our brain chemistry. But it's our thoughts that cause our emotions and behavior. And so it's not just having perfect brain chemistry, as good as that is. If our software is faulty, you can have the best computer, but that computer is not going to work well unless the software is running well. And that's our thoughts. And so we have a lot of ability to be able to manage, control, and even change our thoughts. So emotional intelligence has been shown to contribute more to successful and enjoyable living than even IQ is. Most of academics, we're speaking of children and adolescents, and even in college, most of academics is centered in on IQ. That's you're learning, you're having to retain it in order to take tests, but hopefully you're retaining it so that you can apply that knowledge later. And that's what IQ is about. So much of school today is centered in on IQ. But almost none of it is centered in on EQ. Now, your IQ will get you your first job out of college, studies show, but how far you advance in that job has nothing to do with your IQ anymore. It has to do with your emotional intelligence, something that our children and even our society are a very, what should we say, naive about. And emotional intelligence is learned rather than inherited. IQ has a lot to do with genetics. If your parents were both doctors and high IQ, chances are that child has a high IQ as well. And that child could excel more easily because they can learn quicker. However, studies are showing that you can have a very high IQ and have a low GPA in school. You can have a GPA of 2 or less, and you have a high IQ. What's the problem? The problem is your emotional intelligence. You don't have proper motivation. Motivation has nothing to do with IQ. Motivation has a lot to do with emotional intelligence. And so studies are showing GPA is actually more related to EQ than it is IQ. How high your grades are in school has a lot to do with the motivational aspect of things. And so there are 5 components of emotional intelligence. Knowing our emotions, that means not only to identify what emotions you are feeling, but why you're feeling that way. And if the why has to do that someone just cut you off in traffic and that's why you're angry, you are not understanding your emotions. Because that had something to do with it, but more importantly, it's your thoughts about being cut off in traffic, or your thoughts about the individual that cut you off in traffic that you don't even know, that is causing your emotions. And so some people get a little disturbed about this because they're saying, if I have got emotional problems, it sounds like you're blaming me for those emotions. But you know, thank God it is our thoughts that cause our emotions, because we can change our thoughts. And we can change them to be more accurate and more helpful. And this is something that can work quicker than popping a Xanax pill or taking a shot of whiskey. It will actually work quicker and far better and with better long-term consequences. So once we know our emotions and can understand our thoughts behind those, then we're ready to manage our emotions. People with low emotional intelligence are simply managed by their emotions. Moment by moment, day by day, they're being managed by their emotions. People with high emotional intelligence still have powerful emotions. The difference is they're managing those emotions. And this has something to do with the most important aspect of living the psychological good life, according to Dr. Baumeister at Stanford. Dr. Baumeister, Stanford University is not too far away from Weimar. We've had speakers from Stanford come and give presentations at Weimar. And managing your emotions is critically important to having comprehensive self-control. And Dr. Baumeister says if you want to live the psychological good life, which everyone wants to live, whether you're a Hollywood star, a rock star, or a blueberry farmer in Montana, everyone has a desire to live the good life, the psychological good life. And that's an okay desire to have. We all should have that desire. But very few people know how to get there. And Dr. Baumeister says the avenue of living the psychological good life is to have comprehensive self-control, which you cannot have unless you're able to manage your emotions. And so emotional intelligence is critically important in regards to that. By the way, you might think, self-control? Baumeister also states this, that lack of self-control is the #1 problem in all the world. Heart disease kills more people than COVID. It kills well over 1,000 people every day in this country, and heart disease is completely preventable through nutrition and lifestyle. And we now have the evidence for everybody to basically know that. So why are those 1,000 people dying every day? It's not their heart, it's lack of self-control. Harvard says 80% of cancers could be prevented if we would manage our diet and lifestyle in the best way to avoid cancer. And so cancer is now the #1 cause of death in people under the age of 85 in this country, but 80% of those cancers could be prevented by comprehensive self-control. And those two killed more people even during the COVID pandemic. And then when you look at alcoholism, addictions, addiction rates are at an all-time high. If you're addicted to something, you have lack of self-control. You know it's harming you, but you can't get away with it. And you can't get away from it. And you continue to go back to something that's harmful for you. Why? You're not able to manage your emotions to have comprehensive self-control. And then we could go into many other things, financial failure, marital breakups, many of those are going to have to do with lack of self-control in regards to the partners in the marriage, or at least one of the partners, or the people handling finances. It's not just about us, however, emotional intelligence. It's also about our relationships with others. Managing relationships with others is critically important. Empathy, recognizing emotions in others. And the 5th aspect of emotional intelligence is the one we spoke about. And in the word emotion is another word. That word is motion. If our emotions are based on what's accurate and true, it will powerfully motivate us to achieve our goals. So if you've lost motivation, if you have problems being properly motivated to achieve your worthy goals, there is room for improvement in your emotional intelligence. Now the question is, can these things be taught to children and adolescents? And I have some exciting news for you today. In fact, this study showed that children can actually themselves learn self-control. And they're best set up for it actually by the age of 6. They took a look at 6-year-olds on their ability to have delayed gratification. You know, you've heard of the marshmallow test, where they say, okay, you can have this marshmallow, and you can eat it now, or you can wait, and if you wait, you're going to end up having 2 marshmallows. So that's one way of looking at 6-year-old self-control. And so that delayed gratification aspect, and there's many other ways of looking at that as well. But they found out children with better self-control are actually more popular with other children. This was a study of 6-year-olds. We can predict what a 6-year-old's SAT test will be at age 16 by how much self-control they had at age 6. Now, you think it's important in regards to the school that they went to and all of those things. Yeah, there are some importance to be taught well. But even more important in regards to how well you were taught was how much self-control you had at age 6 in regards to those SAT scores. And of course, those SAT scores can set you up for greater success in life. Displaying self-control by the age of 11, highly correlated with successful employment throughout participants' lives. We can predict at age 11 how good an employee this person will be as an adult. And we can do that simply by seeing how much self-control they have at 11. Participants with low self-control experience 3 times as many months of being unemployed over 22 years when compared with those with high self-control among 11-year-olds. Improving emotional intelligence can effectively prevent or treat depression. This is critically important, as you'll see, because depression is an all-time high in our children and adolescents. Used to be unheard of a few decades ago. Phobias are also effectively treated by improving emotional intelligence. Obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, and bulimia. Also eating disorders that are very common today. And by the way, these disorders sometimes are misunderstood. Anorexia is called in the psychological world a disorder of assumption. Now you might wonder, disorder of assumption? Well, when an anorexic looks in the mirror, what do they see? They see fat. So they look in the mirror and they assume that they're fat. That's the disorder of assumption. Is the solution to that disorder to tell them and affirm them in their fatness? No. If you actually agree with an anorexic that they are fat and tell them they need to quit eating and doing all those sorts of things, what could you end up doing to them? You could end up killing them. And so disorders of assumption are also at an all-time high in other areas. And the solution is not to affirm the assumption. That might have short-term gain and make them feel better short-term, but it's going to have significant long-term consequences. And improving emotional intelligence can improve people to accurately, even think more accurately about themselves and more rational about themselves. Addictions such as alcoholism. Now, AA is the most famous program for people getting over alcohol, but the majority of the people that go to AA do not get over alcohol, unfortunately. And Uncle Bob, who came up with the AA program, stated that you have to be patient when you give up alcohol if you're an alcoholic, because expect the first year of your life to be the worst year of your life. Why? All that withdrawal, and you will get into stinking thinking. Now, when you were an alcoholic, you didn't, if you didn't feel good, you just self-medicated with more alcohol, so you weren't thinking at all. But now all of a sudden you have to think because your frontal lobe isn't suppressed, and that's the thinking portion of our brain, but there's a tendency to get into stinking thinking. But studies show that if we do AA along with a program that improves emotional intelligence, like Optimize Your Brain, 4 times more likely to be successful and never go back to alcohol. Why is that? Because now your first year of sobriety is going to be the best year of your life because you're able to correct your stinking thinking with that frontal lobe that you now have. And what a difference it can make. And so this is critically important to overcoming addictions. And of course, improving emotional intelligence can effectively prevent or treat violence against family and others, can help prevent relationship breakups or heal relationship breakups. But EQ is not just to prevent or treat mental illness. It also helps emotional intelligence. It helps people to think clearer, communicate more effectively, fosters unity in group settings, reduces polarizing statements, promotes a happier life, and all of this is accomplished without compromise or sacrificing the truth. One of the bedrock principles of emotional intelligence is thinking truthful thoughts. Now, it's not just thinking positive thoughts. A lot of times people think, well, Dr. Nedley is just teaching people to ignore the bad and just think positively. No, we want you to think accurately, helpfully, and rationally. Let me give you an example. If you've suffered a severe loss in your life, many people will actually think and say the words, "My world has ended." Is that a true thought? No, your world is still going around. We have to correct even those types of thoughts. Now, we can say that we miss the companionship and love that we shared with the individual who is close to us that maybe have lost their life. That's helpful. It can add meaning to life. And we can talk about things in an accurate way, but to say, "My world has ended," and think some of these extreme thoughts that happen, and even in kids, often they think their world has ended when their parent has taken away their smartphone. And I'm serious. We had an 11-year-old girl jump out of her moving vehicle and almost died. She actually wanted to die because her mom grabbed her phone and took it away from her in the middle of that car ride. So this is stinking thinking. It's not accurate. It's way extreme. It's off the charts. And our kids can learn to, even when bad things happen to them like that. And actually, of course, the mother wasn't doing it to harm her child. She was doing it to help her child. She was looking at the long-term types of things that were going on there. And so we have to be able, even as a child, to start correcting our thoughts and thinking truthful and helpful thoughts. So let's talk about mental disorders in children. ADHD, anxiety problems, behavior problems, and depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children. Remember those four because they are going to come up. Estimates for ever having a diagnosis among children aged 3 to 17 in the 2016 to 2019 years, that's the 4 years, 16, 17, 18, 19, so it's 4 years prior to the pandemic. Now you may say, why is he looking at prior to the pandemic? Because the CDC has not published post-pandemic data yet. We know it's going to be significantly higher, and the evidence is it's at least 25 to 26% higher than these numbers. What this was pre-pandemic numbers. ADHD, about 10% of individuals had already been diagnosed with as ADHD in that 3 to 17-year-old time. Anxiety, 9.4%. So this results in millions of children in America, like 6 million of them having anxiety. Behavioral problems, 8.9%, 5.5 million. Depression, 4.4%, or approximately 2.7 million. And again, that's CDC data. By the way, when was that data published? It was published in 2022. So it's recent publication of analyzing data that was a few years ago. So depression and anxiety have increased over time. Ever having been diagnosed with either anxiety or depression among children aged 6 to 17 years increased from 5.4% in 2003 to 8% in 2007, 8.4% in 2011-2012. So we see it rising significantly in those years, but then something happened and bumped it way up in 2012. Anyone want to guess what that was? Among adolescents aged 12 to 17 years in the 2018-2019 reporting in the past year, so that was the school year prior to the pandemic, and again, CDC published this data last year, 15.1% of our teenagers had a major depressive episode. Remember before? 4%. Now it's just 1 year, 15% having major depression. 36.7% had persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Sadness or hopelessness in over a third of our teenagers, persisting for weeks and months on edge. 4.1% had already had a substance use disorder and they were addicted to a substance. Maybe it was alcohol, maybe it was marijuana, maybe it was some other substance that's not good for them. 1.6% had an alcohol use disorder. By the way, what has not been reported, we always hear about, as we should, school shootings and massive school shootings. But so far, I don't know if it'll be the same this year, so far, there have been more children dying of alcohol poisoning than any school shootings. You add up the school shootings death, it is still surpassed by children drinking too much alcohol and dying as a child as a result. Now that doesn't get in the news. You won't have the news item. It's like, too bad, that kid should have known better. And I wonder where the parents were. How come they weren't finding out that this kid was drinking all this sort of stuff? But the media doesn't report on it. But this is a major problem among many young people, and it's something that really has mental illness at its forefront for their even felt need to be drinking like that. So 3.2% had an illicit drug use disorder. That's double the amount that are on alcohol. And of course, illicit would also include marijuana. It's not legal to be consuming marijuana when you're of that age. 18.8% seriously considered attempting suicide. That's almost 1 out of 5 during the school year prior to the pandemic. Almost 1 out of 5 teenagers seriously thought of ending their own life. 15.7% of them made a suicide plan, and 8.9%, or almost 1 out of 10 individuals who were teenagers, attempted to end their life in just that school year. Are we having a crisis as far as mental health among our children? It is incredible. 2.5% made a suicide attempt requiring medical treatment. That means they ended up in the emergency room. They had done some damage to themselves, and they actually required a medical treatment. And of course, some of those actually were successful in trying to end their own life. In that age group, depending on which state you're in and which part of the country you're in, that can be the #1 cause of death in our young people is suicide. And the lowest it is, about the #3 cause of death among young people. So mental, behavioral, and developmental disorders actually begin in early childhood. 1 in 6 U.S. children had a diagnosed mental, behavioral, or developmental illness. 17.4% in that year. Diagnosis of ADHD, anxiety, and depression become more common with increased age. So the older they get, the more likely they are to experience those disorders. And let's take a look at some of the data here. This is depression rates. And notice when you're under the age of 5, even in the society that we're living in, it's very rare for a young person to experience depression. Now let me explain something about depression. Really, in order to experience depression, you have to be able to reflect upon yourself. This is why, for instance, in the animal kingdom, you don't see, no matter how bad an animal's life is, an animal will never consider taking their own life. They might have the most severe pain, the worst things happen to them, and they're still wanting to live. They would never consider taking their own life. Why? Because they don't have a frontal lobe to be able to reflect upon themselves. They do have some aspect of a frontal lobe, but you have to have a large enough frontal lobe to begin to reflect upon yourself, and 5-year-olds don't have that. Once they get to 6, however, that's more when we start talking about, have you heard about the age of accountability? That's when you are able to reflect upon yourself. And at age 6, they can start getting into depression. and maybe even suicidal thoughts as a result of bad reflections upon themselves. Now, with anxiety, it's different. You know, even in the animal world, you can have severe anxiety in animals, even though they don't have the ability to reflect upon themselves. And the same is true with children. So children 3, 4, and 5 can have severe anxiety. But notice how much that anxiety and depression spikes once they're age 6. It's going up significantly. And now once age 12, you see over 10% of children having severe anxiety in the adolescent years. Behavioral disorders, of course, those can occur before the age of 5 as well. Even in the animal world, you'll have behavioral disorders, even though you don't have the frontal lobe. But notice how it spikes at age 6 to 11, but fortunately that's the only one that tends to come down a little bit after age 11. So when did mental illness particularly begin to skyrocket to these values? It was in 2012. What was the significance of that year? That's when half of Americans owned a smartphone. And we have seen that duplicated in every country of the world since. America was the first one to get there. I was in Kenya in 2019. Kenya has very low rates of depression. If you look at their 2019 data, it's extremely low. And by the way, they're much poorer. It's not economics. People center in on economics thinking that equals happiness. Not true, because the Kenyan people were so much happier. But in 2019, they began to have depression. They began to have more anxiety. They began to have more suicides. And when I was there, the national newspaper published a big article, Depression Rates Skyrocketing in Kenya. And yes, the next day they said, amazing link to smartphone usage. Half of Kenyans now own a smartphone, and it's going up significantly. And of course, it's increased further after that. Now we have about 90 or 100% of, almost 100% of people owning a smartphone. And this is one of the things that would be best to delay our children having this access to smartphones. Now, I should mention, it wasn't intuitive. When 2012 was occurring, I did not think that smartphones would be that bad. For the normal use of smartphones would be that bad for our kids. I was more concerned about some of these Hollywood movies that they would vegetate in front of, and the rapid scene of reference changes, and the frontal lobe suppression, and the implanting of all sorts of bad values. And yes, there is very strong evidence that more movies you watch, the lower your emotional intelligence is going to be, and the lower your frontal lobe function is going to be. And if we really want to enhance that, we want to get away from the Hollywood scene. But what I was not intuitive was, I thought in 2012 that we can interact with our smartphone. In other words, we have to be thinking some to interact with it. And I thought this interaction versus the non-interaction of Hollywood films would not make it as bad, at least. Of course, and I thought it would depend on the content in regards to what we are interacting with. But it turns out I and a lot of the other individuals that were even creating this stuff had no idea what they were going to be doing to our brains. So let me give you an example as to why this is important. And studies have been done on this. You take a kid, they're 14 years old, and now in public high schools and things like that, they are telling these kids, you need to go online to do your homework. And so you go online to do your homework, and studies show, even though they have full intention of getting online and getting that homework done, within 3 minutes of trying to do their homework, they're no longer doing their homework. Why do you think they're no longer doing it? They had full intention to do it. They got distracted. And you know, it may be a benign thing. In other words, the engineers that are controlling the internet and trying to do things, and by the way, it's very clear. In fact, I was just talking to someone yesterday who's part of the engineering world and mentioned that the company he's working for, which is a technology company, is wanting him to understand all the things that can get kids addicted to their site. And so they're doing everything they can to distract them and get them on their site. And so a BMW will start floating across the screen. Why a BMW? Because those engineers know that that 14-year-old is interested in BMWs, because he's clicked on BMW sites before. And then there's a little phrase that says, this new BMW, and it'll give the letters in the thing, are going to be at your local BMW dealer. And would you like to see what this new BMW has? Well, the kid is thinking, hey, this is pretty benign, this is pretty fascinating, I love BMW, so it clicks on that BMW, and then starts learning about all of the fascinating things of this new BMW. But then, all of a sudden, in the midst of him doing that, there's a little news flash, what we call a push notification that comes up, that says, Donald Trump got handcuffed in New York and is in a New York jail. And it's like, what? You know, this is pretty interesting. And so they click on this. And then as they click on this, then a friend of theirs realizes they're online and starts chatting with them about something else that just happened in school. And did you know this girl and whatever? And so they are not paying attention for more than about 90 seconds or 3 minutes on anything because they continue to get distracted. Now you think, well, you know, big deal. In a developing brain, it is a big deal, because the area of our brain that requires us to have focused attention is identical to the area of our brain where we manage distressing emotions. And this is why they won't click on an educational YouTube video that goes 40 minutes, because they realize, I can't concentrate for 40 minutes. I'm into things that are just going to be a minute in length or a minute and a half in length. Why can't they concentrate? Because the anterior cingulate gyrus has begun to prune itself and shrink down, because it says, you don't need me. You never pay attention. And if we're not able to pay attention, we're not going to be able to manage distressing emotions. Now, in yesteryear, without those phones, we could actually get into homework, and we could spend 40 minutes on it and still be very interested in what we're doing, and we're building up that anterior cingulate gyrus, which is going to build up our ability to manage distressing emotions. And so this is something that has produced significant issues. So there were two pandemics in 2020 to 2022. There was the COVID pandemic, but then there was the mental illness pandemic that skyrocketed because we made kids go home and be on their devices to stay away for safety reasons. And so now everybody was in this mode of having their anterior cingulate gyruses assaulted by the normal use of devices. Now, I'm not against devices in general. I use them as well, but I use them very specifically for a specific purpose, and then I get off of them. I don't have push notifications come in. If Donald Trump gets arrested in New York, I'm not going to know about it on my device. I'm not going to allow email notifications to come in where I'm on there and all of a sudden I see I got an email from a certain thing. Now you'd say, how can you do that as president of the university? My faculty know very well what I'm doing, and if they need me bad enough, they can find me. But I am not going to look at their emails unless it's email time. Now there's a certain time of the day I will actually get rid of all of my emails by answering the ones that need to be answered. And sometimes that's at a different time. At one day it might be a morning, at the next day it may be an afternoon, so it might be up to 48 hours before they get an answer. But I don't need to be answering that right away. And if it's something that urgent, they can take some oomph and some motivation to actually physically find me and to do those sorts of things. And so we have to be very particular. In fact, there is an author, in fact, I would encourage you to read, even if you don't doubt what I'm saying, I would encourage you to read the book called Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. Cal Newport is a computer programmer, and he is so good at computer programming that he makes over $1 million a year computer programming, and he refuses to work after 4 p.m. every day. And he still makes that type of money, and he doesn't even advertise his computer programming on the internet. He says, if you're very good, they will find you. And then he talks about how he got that good. How he got that good was total digital minimalism. Never had a Facebook account, never had a social media account, never if there was something that he would get stuck in. By the way, when YouTube came out, he talks about how he would start looking at YouTube and then get distracted by another YouTube video and start wasting time, and so he blocked any of his abilities to utilize YouTube. He says if you get stuck in something and you spent more time on it, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. And he says, don't allow yourself to do that. Now, I've noticed that people don't get rid of their GPS apps. People don't get stuck in their GPS app by, saying, hey, I wonder after I get home, could I have gone a different route, or could I have done this or that? That they don't waste time and get stuck in that. It's a practical app. And so you don't have to get rid of all apps. But really, if you get rid of the majority of the apps, get rid of the push notifications, get rid of the chat notifications, the email notifications, and be very intentional, your brain can start to build up again. And the good news is this anterior cingulate gyrus can also expand if we start working on focused attention. And what a difference it'll make in both academics and emotional intelligence. So, are there studies backing this up? Absolutely. Major longitudinal study looked at the lives of more than 1 million young people. Teens who spent large amounts of time glued to phone and computer screens were markedly, what? Less happy than those who prefer real-world activities and interactions. Social media, texting, video chatting, multi-platform video games, sounds like great fun, but they were all associated with what? A decrease in happiness. The study went on. Youth who invested more time in non-screen activities, such as playing sports, reading actual physical things like newspapers, and engaging in what type of social interactions? Face-to-face social interactions were significantly what? Happier. We need to get back to real-world activities. The life satisfaction, self-worth, and happiness of young people in the U.S. plummeted, here it is, after what? 2012. And they quote this again, the year when the population of Americans owning a smartphone rose to over 50%. So in measuring happiness, they found out the happiest teenagers were those who used digital media less than what? 1 hour per day. After 1 hour, unhappiness rose linearly. So you could just predict how unhappy a person was going to be by how much time they were spending on their devices. And by the way, the studies have shown that social media actually makes us antisocial. Now, we're attracted to it at first because we can connect with people. Maybe they're in a different place and they've moved and we can connect. But studies show that we end up very quickly comparing far more than we connect. And we compare in a false world. Let me give you an example. I was in a beautiful location of the world. My sister-in-law is from the South Island of New Zealand, and she arranged with others for me to go over there in a speaking tour, and they utilize a lot of our programming there in New Zealand now. But in between speaking appointments, she was wanting me to see beautiful New Zealand. And one of the most beautiful places in New Zealand to see is called Milford Sound. If you ever go to New Zealand, you have to go to Milford Sound. And we were flying over in a little airplane, all of these mountains and rivers and streams, kind of like Montana, but a little more tropical. And then we get into this little airport where there's this big fjord in from the ocean. And this fjord has 5,000-foot cliffs. And it's in a rainforest, and so 5,000-foot waterfalls coming down into the ocean. And as we're out in this boat now, we get in this boat, and now dolphins are leaping in front of the boat. We'll talk about dopamine levels this afternoon. My dopamine levels were up there getting into the euphoric stage, which is a healthy thing. But they actually didn't get all the way in the euphoric stage because 2 ladies on that tour boat were arguing in the front of the boat. And they were not happy with each other. And it's like, we're in a public place. Why are you two doing this? And then when this captain slowed down to get close to this waterfall, they realized something was happening when the boat engine came down, and it started to slow as we got to this beautiful location. And then they got out their camera They smiled real big. They actually put their arm around each other. And they took this picture and they uploaded it to their Instagram account and they resumed their arguing. Now, everyone that were on their Instagram account became jealous at that point. Look at where they're at. I'm slaving away, working here at my job, and they're in this most beautiful location, and it looks like they're having a great time. They wouldn't have been a bit jealous had they seen what happened before and after that shot. It'd be like, what in the world are you girls doing? You know, can't even get along in a place like this. What is wrong? But this is what happens with social media. We're comparing ourselves among ourselves in a very false world. And you know, some people will take, and now we have all this social appearance anxiety as a result of the internet. Social appearance anxiety is that you don't even want to come out in public because you think you look so much worse than everyone else that are taking pictures of themselves and uploading it to their account. And you don't realize they actually took 1,000 pictures of themselves and changed all sorts of lighting and found the picture that looked least like them to post. And then our kids are getting jealous at home because, quotes, they don't look like that. And so this is a world that actually is a very unhealthy and false world. So we compare by a false world that actually looks true because it has that appearance of looking true, but it isn't. And time spent with media devices cannot be regained. Media devices waste a lot of time, sometimes hours each day. They keep us from doing healthy activities, spending time with our families, engaging in productive work. And nowadays, it's clear that when children become adults, they've learned far more from their devices than from their parents. And as a result, they tend to trust their device more than their parent. You take the parent away from them at age 17, they're just fine. You take their device away from them at age 17, and they are not fine. They need that relationship with their device, and they need to be able to learn from that device. And of course, the issue is the device can give us some helpful information. If you ask them what the Siri, what the population is of Libby, Montana, chances are you might get the accurate answer of what the census showed in 2020. And so the kid thinks, hey, wow, this is a very smart phone. And so let me ask them, as a result of the fact that I like soccer, am I a boy or a girl? And so they get on and, oh, well, Siri will be able to help me with this too. And so Siri all of a sudden tells them, because all of the technology companies have a certain view in regards to gender, that there are countless, over 300 different genders, and not really showing you evidence of that other than disorders of assumption and aspects of things involved in that. And then pretty soon they start making decisions that can seriously impact their life that they're very regretful of years later. So we need to, but here's the issue with parents. If parents are using their devices at home, children are going to use theirs even more. And so when we are home with our children, we need to be experiencing face-to-face interactions with our children and having them be liking that relationship with us, and also the mentoring that happens. And of course, when kids have free access to smartphones, it gives them access to the creeps of the world. The creeps of the world hang out on the internet. And they will look for some 6-year-old that's posting a picture of herself on a new social media site, and they will begin their work of manipulation in regards to their dialogue with that 6-year-old girl, etc. And it's pretty sad when you actually look at the studies on what's happening. I won't go into the details of that. So Daniel Goleman has written a book called Focus, The Hidden Driver of Excellence. And he says in order to have focus, one of the keys to success is a digital Sabbath. That means using zero technology. Does it say once a week? We think of a Sabbath being once a week, but he says there needs to be a prolonged period of a digital Sabbath every day. and what a difference it will make with humanity. A digital Sabbath is a time when adults and kids are not distracted by devices. During that time, they're engaged in focused learning or healthy activities. This sister-in-law in New Zealand, she's, of course, part of our family, and when we have family events over at her home, there's a little basket, and everyone puts their device in that basket so that we can have good family time. And then she has a rule. The first one that pulls out their device does the dishes. So Victoria Dunkley, she's a child and adolescent psychiatrist in Los Angeles. She has stated that she won't even diagnose behavioral problems, ADHD, depression, or anxiety in any young person until they have gone through an electronic fast of no technology for 6 weeks. She says often it will completely resolve, and they actually don't have this. It's just induced by the normal use of technology. Now, sometimes they will have these diseases even after that, but then we can find out what's a true disease and what is just induced by our technology companies. And so 6 weeks with no screen time. Can you actually live? You know, we have people that come through our program, adolescents. We have a number of adolescents that come through our program. And we take their devices away from them. We actually give them a technology lecture first so they can understand what it's doing and all of that. But you ought to see the looks on their face as they're giving up their device. And they're saying, Dr. Nedley, I'd rather not eat for 10 days than give up my device for 10 days. You don't realize this is actually helping my mental health, they think. It's actually treating their anxiety and depression. And then in 10 days, when they're so much better and their depression and anxiety have resolved, of course, we're looking at other things too, their biochemistry and other things. I have to remind them, you got better in 10 days without any use of technology. And then we have in re-entry, we have a lecture on how they can use technology smartly and no longer just be manipulated by the engineer gurus who are only interested in their self-interest and not yours. So remove phone applications, turn off notifications afterwards, and spend less than an hour a day on device outside of work and not within an hour of going to bed. By the way, there's been studies showing that if you use that device an hour before going to bed, it's going to disrupt your melatonin output, your circadian rhythm. So reading printed books doesn't do that, and so it's good to just set that aside and not use it afterwards. Developmental hits are also at an all-time high in our young people. One of the reasons for increased mental illness. Adverse childhood experience is an all-time high. Abuse is at an all-time high. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and so is neglect. And by the way, if you're using your devices at home extensively as a parent, that actually is one of the definitions of neglect of your children. We think we're not neglecting them because they're on their devices, and it seems like a good babysitter. It's not a good babysitter, and it's one that you will regret later. Household dysfunction at an all-time high. Mental illness, divorce, substance use, violence against mother, incarceration of a relative. The Harvard Mastery of Stress study was a significant study that came out that showed there was one predictor of whether you would have a serious disease by age 50, more so than anything else. What was it? 91% would have a serious disease diagnosed by age 50 if they did not have a good relationship with their mother and father. This is crucial. And many kids today are not having a good relationship with their mom and dad, in part due to some of those other things that have occurred in regards to those developmental hits. And so it is vitally important to develop a good relationship. If you have a good relationship with one but not the other, it helps. So only a coin flip whether you'll have a serious disease by age 50. But if you have a good relationship with both of them, 75% chance you'll be completely healthy with no serious disease by age 50. So, and by the way, we shouldn't necessarily be surprised about that. There's a commandment that says, honor your father and your mother, that your what? Days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. We need to restore families, and devices are destroying families. and far more than we realize. So there have also been studies, and I could go into motherhood. I don't want to give you the idea that motherhood is not important. Good relationship with mom, vitally important, as important as it is with dad, but we often minimize the relationship with dad as not being important. And studies show that if you have a loving, what type of father? Authoritative. In other words, this father brings you to accountability. There are loving fathers that are not authoritative. They tend to be divorced from the mother, and the kids go over father's house, and father wants to be popular, so he takes them to movies, he gives them gifts, but he's not giving them accountability. He's not actually, and of course sometimes it's the opposite way as well. We had a 19-year-old girl come through our program recently, severe panic disorder. And so she would have severe panic, and it would just come up out of the blue, and it was crippling. And she comes to our program, and her parents split up when she was 7. And so the judge asked her which one she wanted to go to. And she said, Mom. I said, why did you make that choice? Because Mom never had any set bedtime, never had any rules for me to follow. And she would have boyfriends come into the house all the time that were different boyfriends and all of this, but I never had any accountability. And when I went over to my dad's, I had to go to bed on time. I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. There was accountability. I said, so who sent you to this program? She says, it was my dad. Who paid for the program? It was my dad. I said, knowing what you know now, would you have made the same choice? She says, absolutely not. I should have gone with my dad. Because that loving, authoritative part of things, and she realized she got messed up by doing the things she wanted to do whenever she wanted to do it, and it wasn't, and she didn't know better in regards to all of those sorts of things. Fortunately, because of the comprehensive aspect of the program, by day 6, her panic was gone, and she loved the schedule. She said, you know, I haven't had a schedule my whole life, but I have to get up on time. I have to do this. I have to do that. She recognized how good it was for her brain to have these variety of things that happen. And by day 6, her panic was gone. And when her dad came up at day 10, he broke down in tears and was just very grateful for having his beautiful daughter restored and to be in that level of positive health. But children of loving, authoritative fathers, higher chance of being an A student, higher IQs, better problem solvers, more likely to enjoy school and be engaged, higher economic and educational achievement of these children, better able to handle strange situations, more resilient in handling stress, more curious in exploring, less depression, and improved life satisfaction. Significant difference of having a loving, authoritative father in the life. In addition, higher conformity to rules, have long-term successful marriages at much higher rates, have more long-term close friends, have higher empathy for others as a result of having that loving, authoritative father, higher moral values, and notice this, 80% less likely to be in jail. Now, often our country looks at this in regards to ethnic groups and those sorts of things. All of that, quotes, disparity goes away when you start looking at, did they have a loving, authoritative father in their life? If they did, 80% less likely to ever go to jail and 75% less likely to have become unwed parents. Unwed parents are going to have a much higher rate of having abuse and neglect in their home in raising those children than a good healthy two-parent household, and they'll actually have better physical health as well. So let's get into some other behaviors that can improve the emotional intelligence of our children. Physical fitness is one of those. As I mentioned last night, it will improve neurotransmitter receptors and release, improves cognitive function, and improves mood significantly, and it can also improve memory. Dr. John Ratey, he was voted the top psychiatrist at Harvard a couple of years ago. His expertise is ADHD, but he has developed a physical fitness program for high schools where the ones who get the A's are not the jocks, it's the ones who improve in cardiovascular fitness. And it makes a significant difference. When they start improving in cardiovascular fitness, it makes a difference in their grades and the things that we just noticed. Junk food will also be linked to lower IQ and EQ. This study was done on 4,000 kids, and you can see the ages, 3, 4, 7, 8.5, controlled for known factors that affect IQ. 20% with the highest processed diet, higher in fats and sugar, had a 5-point lower IQ. That's a half of a standard deviation, compared with the 20% who ate a more health-conscious diet with most fruits, vegetables, salad, pasta, and rice. And by the way, if you were in the top 1% of healthy eaters, you had a 15-point IQ advantage. And so a significant difference, as we kind of alluded to last night. But the major influence on IQ, as important as our behaviors are, they're controlled by our beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about problems, and our silent self-talk. And your feelings actually result more from the messages you give yourself than what is actually happening in your life. And so this is why it's so important to have those rational thoughts. So we're also now teaching children cognitive behavioral therapy starting in the first grade. We actually have a textbook called Millie, but we also revised that textbook culturally as we were asked to develop an emotional intelligence curriculum for now it's grades K through 12 in the public school system in Guam. Guam knew about our work in emotional intelligence, and so they, through their judicial system and legislature and executive branch, they came together and asked us to develop this curriculum because they were having lots of problems with emotional intelligence in their schools. School counselors were having to increase dramatically, and the counseling didn't seem to be doing that much good. And they were having far more issues with family violence, and they thought, well, this is just, you know, the violence of the parents. What can we do about all of this? And so they asked us to develop this curriculum, and we actually started to teach them at a young age about A to C thinking. A to C thinking means the activating event just produces your emotions, and it ignores the B. Dr. Ellis says, believing that we have little or no ability to influence our feelings and the events and situations directly cause our emotions and behavior is crooked thinking. So we still have the activating event, we don't ignore that, but then we have the belief, and that produces the emotional consequence. So we can't do anything about our kids' previous activating events, but we can do something about their present beliefs. So the Pacific Judicial Council heard of the emotional intelligence by those who have been attending the Emotional Intelligence Annual Summits at Weimar University. And Chief Judge Frances Gatewood, who's never been to Weimar, but she's an appointed federal judge, she was appointed by one of our previous presidents, invited me to speak to educators, legislatures, the executive and judicial branches of government. We spoke to all members of the Supreme Court of Guam. Those members actually know Keegan and Sotomayor, who are over that section. Guam is a U.S. territory, and it's under the Ninth Circuit. And so they asked the Ninth Circuit Federal Court to actually support them in this endeavor, and the Ninth Circuit had never done something like this, but they actually supported us to have a team of 10 people, educators and others, write this curriculum and then introduce it as a pilot program in the Guam schools. And so we developed that pilot program. It was just one quarter that we used what we had known from adults in emotional intelligence, but the challenge was to teach it to young people. And of course, you have to do this in an engaging way. You have crafts and those sorts of things. The first, so it had to be comprehensive, interesting, interactive, and engaging. So to be comprehensive, we actually began to teach them. The first unit was about brain anatomy and physiology. How does the brain work? This is something that was very fascinating to the kids as they were learning this. And within a few weeks, we heard stories about their father actually losing the temper in the home, and the child saying, "Dad, I think it's your amygdala doing that." And your amygdala is overpowering your frontal lobe right now. And so And, they were just amazed that his father didn't even know what amygdala was, and looked it up and was just thrilled that his kids were learning about these things in the brain and how to be able to even help their own brain. By the way, we had to have the parental buy-in. So what the public school system did was have what's called outreach. So they brought in all the kids and the parents who were going to be learning this curriculum and taught them what emotional intelligence was. And these were taught by public school elementary teachers who had never taught emotional intelligence before. So we had to teach them how to do it. We had a teacher's manual, teacher's curriculum, and teach them how to do all of the crafts and those sorts of things. And what began to happen was something that the teachers had never seen before. The teacher said, "Never have I taught a course where the student is upset that the class is ending." These classes were only 40 minutes. And they would say, "Teacher, the class is over with already. We love this." And then they would say, "What are we going to learn about tomorrow with our brains?" And they said they would never ask that either. It says when you teach math and science, the kids never ask, "What am I going to learn about tomorrow?" But they were doing that. They were so engaged in it. And with the crafts and the hands-on work, it made it great. And of course, they would have to actually, cut out the amygdala and put it in the right place and show those connections and the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and all of those things. It made such a difference that prior to that, and of course it was a pilot program, so we had to do studies on these individuals. But in some of the islands, it was not just Guam. There was 10 different islands that are associated with Guam, Yip and CNMI, and there's all of these islands out there. Chuuk is the one that really fascinates me the most. There are no vehicles, only boats on Chuuk, because there's just a whole series of islands, and you don't go anywhere by road. You get there by boat, and so it's extremely rural, but yet a lot of these Pacific Islanders living in this area, so they taught it in the Chuuk High School and those sorts of things. But in some of these schools, they would ask the students, "How important is it in regards to emphasizing your brain?" Some of them would say, "It's not important at all." And in fact, in some groups, only 20% of our public high school students thought it was important to emphasize their brain health. After this program, significant difference, where they were now wanting to emphasize their brain health, and none of the kids said it was not important anymore. And of course, they would put it up at very level of importance. So comprehensive brain health was also part of it, where we teach them about nutrition, the things they're putting into their brain, even music and how it can affect the brain. And then we would teach them the foundational principles of emotional intelligence. And then Unit 4 was recognizing and correcting thinking errors. And so we would teach them the 10 different ways that all of us can get into thinking errors, including themselves, and they would start to learn those aspects and begin to apply it in their own life, and also recognize when others were getting into thinking errors. So just a few things. When someone hurts me, I want to get even. You can see that agree and somewhat agree was half of them beforehand, but notice now the big red. In other words, most of them disagree. When someone hurts me, I want to get even. They're now seeing the bigger picture, and they're not just wanting to go into the revenge part. And as far as strongly agree, you can see that very few of them at that point. When I have a major personal problem, I cannot think of anything else. And most of them agreed or somewhat agreed. When they have a problem, they just can't think of anything else. But now they strongly disagree with that. A vast majority now say, I can think of other things and I can handle things. Find it very hard to forgive someone who's done wrong. And so most people agreed. They find it very hard to forgive, but not afterwards. Most disagreed that it's no longer hard to forgive. When I panic when I have to face someone who's angry, most people said they would panic, either agree or somewhat agree. The red is where you want to be, where you disagree with that, and you can see the marked difference in the red after just 10 weeks. If things don't go right, I try to be positive about the situation. Most of them agreed or somewhat agreed, but still 7% disagreed with that. Nobody disagreed with it afterwards. In other words, I can now try to be positive. So I think it's important. This was the CHUK data. Strongly agree it's important to take care of your brain.
52 up to 85%. The other 15% somewhat agreed, but no one disagreed with it now. I get upset when I don't get my way. The majority of students would get upset when they don't get their way, and notice how it dropped to 32% in just 10 weeks. And when I've gotten so angry, I've become physically violent, hitting people or breaking things. 42% of the CHUK students said that they would do that when they would get angry, now down to 14%. In fact, one of the children in a high school, we also taught ninth grade, she was a ninth grader. We had a ninth grade curriculum, and she had been kicked out of a couple of public high schools because of fighting and violence. And a teacher was out there at recess where this girl was severely mistreated by some people on the field, and they thought, uh-oh, this girl's a fighter, here it comes. And the girl just got up and walked away. And the teacher said, what happened? I know, you'd been kicked out of other schools. And she says, it's that EQ curriculum. Do you regularly examine your tangled thoughts? Prior to that, only 23% of kids examined their thoughts, 82% of them afterwards. And we could go into other things like sleep and regular meals. I won't go into all of the data here. Being bored with life went down significantly. So now they're no longer bored with life, and again, forgiveness rates go up. So students liked the application and crafts. They enjoyed the gratitude exercises. They started to actually like healthy music, which wasn't even really there on the islands. Physically exercising more. They began to eat healthier. They enjoyed analyzing their thoughts for distortion. They were able to manage their emotions, less anger, and better behaviors. And these changes took place in just 10 weeks in 1 quarter. So we were back in December. In December, we went through that reporting conference where all the teachers that had taught it came together on Guam. They reported their data. They reported their experiences. In fact, one of the teachers who was teaching the 5th grade curriculum said, I was going through a bad divorce. And he said, I didn't understand why the marriage wasn't working out. And he said, when I had to teach this EQ curriculum, I realized my marriage was breaking up because of my own lack of emotional intelligence. And so he says, I started applying the principles I was teaching my kids, and my marriage has been restored. My marriage has been saved as a result of teaching this curriculum. One of the teachers from YIP, and most of these islands are what would we say? Well, anyways, most of these islands are not very Christian, or if they are Christian, it's more nominally so. But one of the teachers, even though we weren't teaching any spiritual aspects, we were just teaching out of the New Start principles, the first 7 of those principles, one of the teachers stood up and said, I realized what I was teaching to my kids was more important than religion. And she says, let me explain this. Our religion teaches us what we must do before we die, before we go to heaven. But my 5th graders realize that death is a long ways away for them. They're not thinking about it at all. But what I realized was I was teaching them how to have heaven on earth right now. And so, and then that actually opened up a spiritual discussion in the room as well. So we're now developing a curriculum for all of the grades. And they want it for all year long, and we're trying to get that ready to roll out in August. There's a prediction that was made that I often wondered how it would be fulfilled. We shall see medical missionary work broadening and deepening at every point of its progress because of the inflowing of hundreds and thousands of streams until the whole earth is covered as waters cover the sea. This is a prediction of what will happen before this world comes to a close. And I often wondered how it would happen, but it actually could happen through the public school system mandating this emotional intelligence curriculum that has so much to do with health of body and brain and how we are thinking that the entire world could actually change. At this point, it seems like almost impossible for the world to change for the better, but the entire world could have this opportunity to change for the better as a result of expanding this curriculum. Well, I hope this is helpful and hopeful for us to turn the tide in regards to the emotional issues of our children and adolescents. And I see that I've gone a little bit over time, so I will not answer questions now, but if you have questions, please save them. We'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, and we will go into our next service. Thank you.